the new God of the Anointedest, the new gods of the Anointedest, the new God of the Anointedest, the new goddess of the Anointedest, the new goddesses of the Anointedest, the new goddess of the Anointedest, the old God of the Anointedest, the old gods of the Anointedest, the old God of the Anointedest, the old goddess of the Anointedest, the old goddesses of the Anointedest, the old goddess of the Anointedest, the greater God of the Anointedest, the greater gods of the Anointedest, the greater God of the Anointedest, the greater goddess of the Anointedest, the greater goddesses of the Anointedest, the greater goddess of the Anointedest, the lesser God of the Anointedest, the lesser gods of the Anointedest, the lesser God of the Anointedest, the lesser goddess of the Anointedest, the lesser goddesses of the Anointedest, the lesser goddess of the Anointedest, the higher God of the Anointedest, the higher gods of the Anointedest, the higher God of the Anointedest, the higher goddess of the Anointedest, the higher goddesses of the Anointedest, the higher goddess of the Anointedest, the lower God of the Anointedest, the lower gods of the Anointedest, the lower God of the Anointedest, the lower goddess of the Anointedest, the lower goddesses of the Anointedest, the lower goddess of the Anointedest, the greater spirit of the Anointedest, the greater spirits of the Anointedest, the greater spirit of the Anointedest, the lesser spirit of the Anointedest, the lesser spirits of the Anointedest, the lesser spirit of the Anointedest, the higher spirit of the Anointedest, the higher spirits of the Anointedest, the higher spirit of the Anointedest, the lower spirit of the Anointedest, the lower spirits of the Anointedest, the lower spirit of the Anointedest, the major God of the Anointedest, the major gods of the Anointedest, the major God of the Anointedest, the major goddess of the Anointedest, the major goddesses of the Anointedest, the major goddess of the Anointedest, the minor God of the Anointedest, the minor gods of the Anointedest, the minor God of the Anointedest, the minor goddess of the Anointedest, the minor goddesses of the Anointedest, the minor goddess of the Anointedest, the superior God of the Anointedest, the superior gods of the Anointedest, the superior God of the Anointedest, the superior goddess of the Anointedest, the superior goddesses of the Anointedest, the superior goddess of the Anointedest, the inferior God of the Anointedest, the inferior gods of the Anointedest, the inferior God of the Anointedest, the inferior goddess of the Anointedest, the inferior goddesses of the Anointedest, the inferior goddess of the Anointedest, the ancestor God of the Anointedest, the ancestor gods of the Anointedest, the ancestor God of the Anointedest, the ancestor goddess of the Anointedest, the ancestor goddesses of the Anointedest, the ancestor goddess of the Anointedest, the ascendant God of the Anointedest, the ascendant gods of the Anointedest, the ascendant God of the Anointedest, the ascendant goddess of the Anointedest, the ascendant goddesses of the Anointedest, the ascendant goddess of the Anointedest, the descendant God of the Anointedest, the descendant gods of the Anointedest, the descendant God of the Anointedest, the descendant goddess of the Anointedest, the descendant goddesses of the Anointedest, the descendant goddess of the Anointedest, the transcendent God of the Anointedest, the transcendent gods of the Anointedest, the transcendent God of the Anointedest, the transcendent goddess of the Anointedest, the transcendent goddesses of the Anointedest, the transcendent goddess of the Anointedest, the past God of the Anointedest, the past gods of the Anointedest, the past God of the Anointedest, the past goddess of the Anointedest, the past goddesses of the Anointedest, the past goddess of the Anointedest, the present God of the Anointedest, the present gods of the Anointedest, the present God of the Anointedest, the present goddess of the Anointedest, the present goddesses of the Anointedest, the present goddess of the Anointedest, the future God of the Anointedest, the future gods of the Anointedest, the future God of the Anointedest, the future goddess of the Anointedest, the future goddesses of the Anointedest, the future goddess of the Anointedest, the authentic God of the Anointedest, the authentic gods of the Anointedest, the authentic God of the Anointedest, the authentic goddess of the Anointedest, the authentic goddesses of the Anointedest, the authentic goddess of the Anointedest, the synthetic god of the Anointedest, the synthetic gods of the Anointedest, the synthetic god of the Anointedest, the synthetic goddess of the Anointedest, the synthetic goddesses of the Anointedest, the synthetic goddess of the Anointedest, the progressive god of the Anointedest, the progressive gods of the Anointedest, the progressive god of the Anointedest, the progressive goddess of the Anointedest, the progressive goddesses of the Anointedest, the progressive goddess of the Anointedest, the regressive god of the Anointedest, the regressive gods of the Anointedest, the regressive god of the Anointedest, the regressive goddess of the Anointedest, the regressive goddesses of the Anointedest, the regressive goddess of the Anointedest, the ordinary god of the Anointedest, the ordinary gods of the Anointedest, the ordinary god of the Anointedest, the ordinary goddess of the Anointedest, the ordinary goddesses of the Anointedest, the ordinary goddess of the Anointedest, the extraordinary god of the Anointedest, the extraordinary gods of the Anointedest, the extraordinary god of the Anointedest, the extraordinary goddess of the Anointedest, the extraordinary goddesses of the Anointedest, the extraordinary goddess of the Anointedest, the static god of the Anointedest, the static gods of the Anointedest, the static god of the Anointedest, the static goddess of the Anointedest, the static goddesses of the Anointedest, the static goddess of the Anointedest, the dynamic god of the Anointedest, the dynamic gods of the Anointedest, the dynamic god of the Anointedest, the dynamic goddess of the Anointedest, the dynamic goddesses of the Anointedest, the dynamic goddess of the Anointedest, the land god of the Anointedest, the land gods of the Anointedest, the land god of the Anointedest, the land goddess of the Anointedest, the land goddesses of the Anointedest, the land goddess of the Anointedest, the sea god of the Anointedest, the sea gods of the Anointedest, the sea god of the Anointedest, the sea goddess of the Anointedest, the sea goddesses of the Anointedest, the sea goddess of the Anointedest, the sky god of the Anointedest, the sky gods of the Anointedest, the sky god of the Anointedest, the sky goddess of the Anointedest, the sky goddesses of the Anointedest, the sky goddess of the Anointedest, the god of the Anointedest, the gods of the Anointedest, the god of the Anointedest, the goddess of the Anointedest, the goddesses of the Anointedest, the goddess of the Anointedest, the half god of the Anointedest, the half gods of the Anointedest, the half god of the Anointedest, the half goddess of the Anointedest, the half goddesses of the Anointedest, the half goddess of the Anointedest, the vessel of the Anointedest, the vessels of the Anointedest, the vessel of the Anointedest, the name of the Anointedest, the names of the Anointedest, the name of the Anointedest, the person of the Anointedest, the persons of the Anointedest, the person of the Anointedest, the persona of the Anointedest, the personas of the Anointedest, the persona of the Anointedest, the personage of the Anointedest, the personages of the Anointedest, the personage of the Anointedest, the personality of the Anointedest, the personalities of the Anointedest, the personality of the Anointedest, the personification of the Anointedest, the personifications of the Anointedest, the personification of the Anointedest, the image of the Anointedest, the images of the Anointedest, the image of the Anointedest, the imagination of the Anointedest, the imaginations of the Anointedest, the imagination of the Anointedest, the belief of the Anointedest, the beliefs of the Anointedest, the belief of the Anointedest, the thought of the Anointedest, the thoughts of the Anointedest, the thought of the Anointedest, the word of the Anointedest, the words of the Anointedest, the word of the Anointedest, the action of the Anointedest, the actions of the Anointedest, the action of the Anointedest, the reaction of the Anointedest, the reactions of the Anointedest, the reaction of the Anointedest, the feeling of the Anointedest, the feelings of the Anointedest, the feeling of the Anointedest, the situation of the Anointedest, the situations of the Anointedest, the situation of the Anointedest, the circumstance of the Anointedest, the circumstances of the Anointedest, the circumstance of the Anointedest, the environment of the Anointedest, the environments of the Anointedest, the environment of the Anointedest, The relationship of the Anointedest. The relationships of the Anointedest. The relationship of the Anointedest. The number of the Anointedest. The numbers of the Anointedest. The number of the Anointedest. The formula of the Anointedest. The formulas of the Anointedest. The formula of the Anointedest. The equation of the Anointedest. The equations of the Anointedest. The equation of the Anointedest. The theory of the Anointedest. The theories of the Anointedest. The theory of the Anointedest. The symbol of the Anointedest. The symbols of the Anointedest. The symbol of the Anointedest. The color of the Anointedest. The colors of the Anointedest. The color of the Anointedest. The thing of the Anointedest. The things of the Anointedest. The thing of the Anointedest. The way of the Anointedest. The ways of the Anointedest. The way of the Anointedest. The place of the Anointedest. The places of the Anointedest. The place of the Anointedest. The time of the Anointedest. The times of the Anointedest. The time of the Anointedest. The event of the Anointedest. The events of the Anointedest. The event of the Anointedest. The result of the Anointedest. The results of the Anointedest. The result of the Anointedest. The crown of the Anointedest. The crowns of the Anointedest. The crown of the Anointedest. The throne of the Anointedest. The thrones of the Anointedest. The throne of the Anointedest. The Anointedest King. The Anointedest Kings. The Anointedest Kingdom. The Anointedest Kingdoms. The Anointedest King's subject. The Anointedest King's subjects. The Anointedest King's dominion. The Anointedest King's dominions. The kingdom of the Anointedest. The kingdoms of the Anointedest. The kingdom of the Anointedest. The Anointedest Queen. The Anointedest Queens. The Anointedest Queendom. The Anointedest Queendoms. The Anointedest Queen's subject. The Anointedest Queen's subjects. The Anointedest Queen's dominion. The Anointedest Queen's dominions. The Queendom of the Anointedest. The Queendoms of the Anointedest. The Queendom of the Anointedest. The Anointedest Prince. The Anointedest Princes. The Anointedest Princedom. The Anointedest Princedoms. The Anointedest Prince's subject. The Anointedest Prince's subjects. The Anointedest Prince's dominion. The Anointedest Prince's dominions. The Princedom of the Anointedest. The Princedoms of the Anointedest. The Princedom of the Anointedest. The Anointedest Princess. The Anointedest Princesses. The Anointedest Princessdom. The Anointedest Princessdoms. The Anointedest Princess's subject. The Anointedest Princess's subjects. The Anointedest Princess's dominion. The Anointedest Princess's dominions. The Princessdom of the Anointedest. The Princessdoms of the Anointedest. The Princessdom of the Anointedest. The Lord of the Anointedest. The Lords of the Anointedest. The Lord of the Anointedest. The Lordess of the Anointedest. The Lordesses of the Anointedest. The Lordess of the Anointedest. The Priest of the Anointedest. The Priests of the Anointedest. The Priest of the Anointedest. The Priestess of the Anointedest. The Priestesses of the Anointedest. The Priestess of the Anointedest. The Ritual of the Anointedest. The Rituals of the Anointedest. The Ritual of the Anointedest. The Shrine of the Anointedest. The Shrines of the Anointedest. The Shrine of the Anointedest. The Temple of the Anointedest. The Temples of the Anointedest. The Temple of the Anointedest. The Leader of the Anointedest. The Leaders of the Anointedest. The Leader of the Anointedest. The Follower of the Anointedest. The Followers of the Anointedest. The Follower of the Anointedest. The Natural Substance of the Anointedest. The Natural Substances of the Anointedest. The Natural Substance of the Anointedest. The Supernatural Substance of the Anointedest. The Supernatural Substances of the Anointedest. The Supernatural Substance of the Anointedest. The Temporal Substance of the Anointedest. The Temporal Substances of the Anointedest. The Temporal Substance of the Anointedest. The Spiritual Substance of the Anointedest. The Spiritual Substances of the Anointedest. The Spiritual Substance of the Anointedest. The Natural Form of the Anointedest. The Natural Forms of the Anointedest. The Natural Form of the Anointedest. The Supernatural Form of the Anointedest. The Supernatural Forms of the Anointedest. the supernatural form of the Anointedest, the temporal form of the Anointedest, the temporal forms of the Anointedest, the temporal form of the Anointedest, the spiritual form of the Anointedest, the spiritual forms of the Anointedest, the spiritual form of the Anointedest, the age of the Anointedest, the ages of the Anointedest, the age of the Anointedest, the era of the Anointedest, the eras of the Anointedest, the era of the Anointedest, the awakener of the Anointedest, the awakeners of the Anointedest, the awakener of the Anointedest, the awakening of the Anointedest, the awakenings of the Anointedest, the awakening of the Anointedest, the realm of the Anointedest, the realms of the Anointedest, the realm of the Anointedest, the dimension of the Anointedest, the dimensions of the Anointedest, the dimension of the Anointedest, the zone of the Anointedest, the zones of the Anointedest, the zone of the Anointedest, the frequency of the Anointedest, the frequencies of the Anointedest, the frequency of the Anointedest, the century of the Anointedest, the centuries of the Anointedest, the century of the Anointedest, the millennium of the Anointedest, the millenniums of the Anointedest, the millennium of the Anointedest, the purpose of the Anointedest, the purposes of the Anointedest, the purpose of the Anointedest, the meaning of the Anointedest, the meanings of the Anointedest, the meaning of the Anointedest, the culture of the Anointedest, the cultures of the Anointedest, the culture of the Anointedest, the demonstrator of the Anointedest, the demonstrators of the Anointedest, the demonstrator of the Anointedest, the demonstration of the Anointedest, the demonstrations of the Anointedest, the demonstration of the Anointedest, the manifester of the Anointedest, the manifestors of the Anointedest, the manifester of the Anointedest, the manifestation of the Anointedest, the manifestations of the Anointedest, the manifestation of the Anointedest, the presence of the Anointedest, the presences of the Anointedest, the presence of the Anointedest, the glow of the Anointedest, the glows of the Anointedest, the glow of the Anointedest, the goal of the Anointedest, the goals of the Anointedest, the goal of the Anointedest, the plan of the Anointedest, the plans of the Anointedest, the plan of the Anointedest, the book of the Anointedest, the books of the Anointedest, the book of the Anointedest, the philosopher of the Anointedest, the philosophers of the Anointedest, the philosopher of the Anointedest, the philosophy of the Anointedest, the philosophies of the Anointedest, the philosophy of the Anointedest, the releaser of the Anointedest, the releasers of the Anointedest, the releaser of the Anointedest, the release of the Anointedest, the releases of the Anointedest, the release of the Anointedest, the variable of the Anointedest, the variables of the Anointedest, the variable of the Anointedest, the cause of the Anointedest, the causes of the Anointedest, the cause of the Anointedest, the effect of the Anointedest, the effects of the Anointedest, the effect of the Anointedest, the journey of the Anointedest, the journeys of the Anointedest, the journey of the Anointedest, the emergence of the Anointedest, the emergences of the Anointedest, the emergence of the Anointedest, the source of the Anointedest, the sources of the Anointedest, the source of the Anointedest, the originator of the Anointedest, the originators of the Anointedest, the originator of the Anointedest, the origin of the Anointedest, the origins of the Anointedest, the origin of the Anointedest, the forefather of the Anointedest, the forefathers of the Anointedest, the forefather of the Anointedest, the foremother of the Anointedest, the foremothers of the Anointedest, the foremother of the Anointedest, the ancestor of the Anointedest, the ancestors of the Anointedest, the ancestor of the Anointedest, the descendant of the Anointedest, the descendants of the Anointedest, the descendant of the Anointedest, the lineage of the Anointedest, the lineages of the Anointedest, the lineage of the Anointedest, the heritage of the Anointedest, the heritages of the Anointedest, the heritage of the Anointedest, the heir of the Anointedest, the heirs of the Anointedest, the heir of the Anointedest, the co-heir of the Anointedest, the co-heirs of the Anointedest, the co-heir of the Anointedest, the joint heir of the Anointedest, the joint heirs of the Anointedest, the joint heir of the Anointedest, the dynasty of the Anointedest, The dynasties of the Anointedest. The dynasty of the Anointedest. The force of the Anointedest. The forces of the Anointedest. The force of the Anointedest. The law of the Anointedest. The laws of the Anointedest. The law of the Anointedest. The pact of the Anointedest. The pacts of the Anointedest. The pact of the Anointedest. The game of the Anointedest. The games of the Anointedest. The game of the Anointedest. The mask of the Anointedest. The masks of the Anointedest. The mask of the Anointedest. The armor of the Anointedest. The armors of the Anointedest. The armor of the Anointedest. The sword of the Anointedest. The swords of the Anointedest. The sword of the Anointedest. The shield of the Anointedest. The shields of the Anointedest. The shield of the Anointedest. The force shield of the Anointedest. The force shields of the Anointedest. The force shield of the Anointedest. The armored force shield of the Anointedest. The armored force shields of the Anointedest. The armored force shield of the Anointedest. The champion of the Anointedest. The champions of the Anointedest. The champion of the Anointedest. The guardian of the Anointedest. The guardians of the Anointedest. The guardian of the Anointedest. The defender of the Anointedest. The defenders of the Anointedest. The defender of the Anointedest. The protector of the Anointedest. The protectors of the Anointedest. The protector of the Anointedest. The chant of the Anointedest. The chants of the Anointedest. The chant of the Anointedest. The shape of the Anointedest. The shapes of the Anointedest. The shape of the Anointedest. The cube of the Anointedest. The cubes of the Anointedest. The cube of the Anointedest. The cuboid of the Anointedest. The cuboids of the Anointedest. The cuboid of the Anointedest. The sphere of the Anointedest. The spheres of the Anointedest. The sphere of the Anointedest. The spheroid of the Anointedest. The spheroids of the Anointedest. The spheroid of the Anointedest. The prism of the Anointedest. The prisms of the Anointedest. The prism of the Anointedest. The pyramid of the Anointedest. The pyramids of the Anointedest. The pyramid of the Anointedest. The cylinder of the Anointedest. The cylinders of the Anointedest. The cylinder of the Anointedest. The cone of the Anointedest. The cones of the Anointedest. The cone of the Anointedest. The triangle of the Anointedest. The triangles of the Anointedest. The triangle of the Anointedest. The circle of the Anointedest. The circles of the Anointedest. The circle of the Anointedest. The semicircle of the Anointedest. The semicircles of the Anointedest. The semicircle of the Anointedest. The square of the Anointedest. The squares of the Anointedest. The square of the Anointedest. The rectangle of the Anointedest. The rectangles of the Anointedest. The rectangle of the Anointedest. The parallelogram of the Anointedest. The parallelograms of the Anointedest. The parallelogram of the Anointedest. The rhombus of the Anointedest. The rhombuses of the Anointedest. The rhombus of the Anointedest. The trapezoid of the Anointedest. The trapezoids of the Anointedest. The trapezoid of the Anointedest. The polygon of the Anointedest. The polygons of the Anointedest. The polygon of the Anointedest. The pentagon of the Anointedest. The pentagons of the Anointedest. The pentagon of the Anointedest. The hexagon of the Anointedest. The hexagons of the Anointedest. The hexagon of the Anointedest. The septagon of the Anointedest. The septagons of the Anointedest. The septagon of the Anointedest. The octagon of the Anointedest. The octagons of the Anointedest. The octagon of the Anointedest. The nonagon of the Anointedest. The nonagons of the Anointedest. The nonagon of the Anointedest. The decagon of the Anointedest. The decagons of the Anointedest. The decagon of the Anointedest. The evolution of the Anointedest. The evolutions of the Anointedest. The evolution of the Anointedest. The revolution of the Anointedest. The revolutions of the Anointedest. The revolution of the Anointedest. The elemental art of the Anointedest. The elemental arts of the Anointedest. The elemental art of the Anointedest. The elemental science of the Anointedest. The elemental sciences of the Anointedest. The elemental science of the Anointedest. The elemental principle of the Anointedest. The elemental principles of the Anointedest. The elemental principle of the Anointedest. The elemental technology of the Anointedest. The elemental technologies of the Anointedest. The elemental technology of the Anointedest. The low elemental art of the Anointedest. The low elemental arts of the Anointedest. The low elemental art of the Anointedest. The low elemental science of the Anointedest. The low elemental sciences of the Anointedest. The low elemental science of the Anointedest. The low elemental principle of the Anointedest. The low elemental principles of the Anointedest. The low elemental principle of the Anointedest. The low elemental technology of the Anointedest. The low elemental technologies of the Anointedest. The low elemental technology of the Anointedest. The high elemental art of the Anointedest. The high elemental arts of the Anointedest. The high elemental art of the Anointedest. The high elemental science of the Anointedest. The high elemental sciences of the Anointedest. The high elemental science of the Anointedest. The high elemental principle of the Anointedest. The high elemental principles of the Anointedest. The high elemental principle of the Anointedest. The high elemental technology of the Anointedest. The high elemental technologies of the Anointedest. The high elemental technology of the Anointedest. The agent of the Anointedest. The agents of the Anointedest. The agent of the Anointedest. The agency of the Anointedest. The agencies of the Anointedest. The agency of the Anointedest. The amplifier of the Anointedest. The amplifiers of the Anointedest. The amplifier of the Anointedest. The amplification of the Anointedest. The amplifications of the Anointedest. The amplification of the Anointedest. The enhancer of the Anointedest. The enhancers of the Anointedest. The enhancer of the Anointedest. The enhancement of the Anointedest. The enhancements of the Anointedest. The enhancement of the Anointedest. The magnifier of the Anointedest. The magnifiers of the Anointedest. The magnifier of the Anointedest. The magnification of the Anointedest. The magnifications of the Anointedest. The magnification of the Anointedest. The influencer of the Anointedest. The influencers of the Anointedest. The influencer of the Anointedest. The influence of the Anointedest. The influences of the Anointedest. The influence of the Anointedest. The emanator of the Anointedest. The emanators of the Anointedest. The emanator of the Anointedest. The emanation of the Anointedest. The emanations of the Anointedest. The emanation of the Anointedest. The converger of the Anointedest. The convergers of the Anointedest. The converger of the Anointedest. The convergence of the Anointedest. The convergences of the Anointedest. The convergence of the Anointedest. The aura of the Anointedest. The auras of the Anointedest. The aura of the Anointedest. The impression of the Anointedest. The impressions of the Anointedest. The impression of the Anointedest. The intelligence of the Anointedest. The intelligences of the Anointedest. The intelligence of the Anointedest. The sophistication of the Anointedest. The sophistications of the Anointedest. The sophistication of the Anointedest. The genius of the Anointedest. The geniuses of the Anointedest. The genius of the Anointedest. The polymath of the Anointedest. The polymaths of the Anointedest. The polymath of the Anointedest. The psychic of the Anointedest. The psychics of the Anointedest. The psychic of the Anointedest. The knowledge of the Anointedest. The knowledges of the Anointedest. The knowledge of the Anointedest. The understanding of the Anointedest. The understandings of the Anointedest. The understanding of the Anointedest. The wisdom of the Anointedest. The wisdoms of the Anointedest. The wisdom of the Anointedest. The secret of the Anointedest. The secrets of the Anointedest. The secret of the Anointedest. The mystery of the Anointedest. The mysteries of the Anointedest. The mystery of the Anointedest. The revelation of the Anointedest. The revelations of the Anointedest. The revelation of the Anointedest. The tactic of the Anointedest. The tactics of the Anointedest. The tactic of the Anointedest. The strategy of the Anointedest. The strategies of the Anointedest. The strategy of the Anointedest. The strength of the Anointedest. The strengths of the Anointedest. The strength of the Anointedest. The might of the Anointedest. The mights of the Anointedest. The might of the Anointedest. The power of the Anointedest. The powers of the Anointedest. The power of the Anointedest. The authority of the Anointedest. The authorities of the Anointedest. The authority of the Anointedest. The dominion of the Anointedest. the dominions of the Anointedest, the dominion of the Anointedest, the rhythm of the Anointedest, the rhythms of the Anointedest, the rhythm of the Anointedest, the melody of the Anointedest, the melodies of the Anointedest, the melody of the Anointedest, the music of the Anointedest, the musics of the Anointedest, the music of the Anointedest, the lyric of the Anointedest, the lyrics of the Anointedest, the lyric of the Anointedest, the song of the Anointedest, the songs of the Anointedest, the song of the Anointedest, the dance of the Anointedest, the dances of the Anointedest, the dance of the Anointedest, the spirit of the Anointedest, the spirits of the Anointedest, the spirit of the Anointedest, the soul of the Anointedest, the souls of the Anointedest, the soul of the Anointedest, the body of the Anointedest, the bodies of the Anointedest, the body of the Anointedest, the mark of the Anointedest, the marks of the Anointedest, the mark of the Anointedest, the promise of the Anointedest, the promises of the Anointedest, the promise of the Anointedest, the visionary of the Anointedest, the visionaries of the Anointedest, the visionary of the Anointedest, the vision of the Anointedest, the visions of the Anointedest, the vision of the Anointedest, the picture of the Anointedest, the pictures of the Anointedest, the picture of the Anointedest, the sound of the Anointedest, the sounds of the Anointedest, the sound of the Anointedest, the tongue of the Anointedest, the tongues of the Anointedest, the tongue of the Anointedest, the language of the Anointedest, the languages of the Anointedest, the language of the Anointedest, the communication of the Anointedest, the communications of the Anointedest, the communication of the Anointedest, the people of the Anointedest, the peoples of the Anointedest, the people of the Anointedest, the society of the Anointedest, the societies of the Anointedest, the society of the Anointedest, the fortress of the Anointedest, the fortresses of the Anointedest, the fortress of the Anointedest, the government of the Anointedest, the governments of the Anointedest, the government of the Anointedest, the city of the Anointedest, the cities of the Anointedest, the city of the Anointedest, the nation of the Anointedest, the nations of the Anointedest, the nation of the Anointedest, the civilization of the Anointedest, the civilizations of the Anointedest, the civilization of the Anointedest, the world of the Anointedest, the worlds of the Anointedest, the world of the Anointedest,